You clicked because you saw the words hobo and meat and preservation together, and some part of you already knows the grocery store is not your friend anymore. Good, you made the right choice. Because what I am about to hand you kept people alive when they had no refrigerator, no money, and no promise of a next meal. Here is the truth most folks will never hear. During the Great Depression, men and women with nothing but a tin can, a handful of salt, and a scrap of fat kept meat safe and edible for weeks, sometimes months, without electricity. They did not get sick. They did not waste a single ounce. And that knowledge nearly died with them. I am going to give you 20 of those tricks tonight. And I am saving the strangest one for last, a method I found tucked inside a 1937 Federal Writers Project interview from Arkansas that stopped me cold when I read it. Every one of these works on a fixed income, in a small kitchen, with what you already own. I still remember my grandmother's hands. She had a brown crochets of a bread box that sat in the corner of her pantry, and I watched her lower pork into it under a lid of white fat like she was tucking a child into bed. I was maybe 8. I thought she was old-fashioned and a little strange. I was wrong, and it took me 50 years and a lot of thrown-away money to admit it. Let me start where the hobos started, with salt. Now you think you know salt? You sprinkle it on eggs and forget it. But in the 1930s, salt was survival, and the men riding the rails carried it like gold. Here is the thing nobody tells you. Salt does not just flavor meat. It pulls the water out of the meat and out of the bacteria trying to spoil it. Bacteria need moisture to live. Take the water away, and they simply cannot grow. That is not folklore. That is biology, confirmed by agricultural extension studies going back over 100 years. The old way was dry salting. You take fresh meat. You rub coarse salt into every surface, packing it thick, and you lay it in a box or crock with more salt underneath and on top. My grandfather told me the rule was 1 pound of salt for every 4 pounds of meat for a hard cure. The salt draws a brine out of the meat itself within a day or two. In a cool place, that pork could hang on for weeks, while the family with the electric icebox down the road was throwing spoiled cuts in the trash. But salt alone was just the beginning, because the men who rode the trains learned something the settled folks forgot. They learned that a fire could preserve meat as surely as salt could. Smoke. Here is what shocked me when I first understood it. Smoke is not just flavor either. Wood smoke carries compounds, formaldehyde and certain acids, that actually kill bacteria on the surface of the meat and slow the fats from going rancid. A hobo camp with a slow, smoldering fire of hardwood, never softwood because pine would turn the meat bitter and sooty, could cold smoke thin strips of meat hung on green sticks over low coals for a day and turn them into something that would ride in a coat pocket for a week without spoiling. The trick was low and slow. You never wanted flame licking the meat. You wanted a lazy, cool smoke, the kind that makes your eyes water from 10 feet away. They would build the fire in a pit, then choke it down with damp wood and green leaves so it smoldered instead of burned. The meat hung above in the drifting smoke, sometimes inside a barrel with the top and bottom knocked out to make a chimney. You can do a version of this today on a covered grill for almost nothing, with a handful of wood chips and the coals pushed to one side. But smoke was only half of what those camps did with fire, because there was a second method that looks like magic until you understand it. Now think about this. How do you keep cooked meat safe for a month with no cold at all? The answer is fat, and it is the method I watched my grandmother use with that brown crock. They called it potting, and the French called it confit, but the poorest men in America were doing it in coffee cans over a rail yard fire without ever knowing a fancy word for it. You cook the meat slowly in its own fat, or in lard, until it is fully done. Then you pack it tight into a jar or crock, and you pour hot melted fat over the top until the meat is completely sealed under a solid layer. When that fat cools and hardens, it locks the air out. No air, No oxygen for the bacteria and mold that cause spoilage. My grandmother would tell you the fat had to cover the meat by a full inch, and not a single piece could be poking through the surface. One exposed corner and the whole crock could turn, kept in a cool cellar. Potted pork lasted her family through the winter. She served it well into spring when the garden was still bare dirt. That knowledge fed people for months on the meat from a single hog. But here is where I have to stop and tell you something that made me angry when I finally figured it out. These methods did not fade away by accident. Somebody profited when we forgot them. Somebody made a fortune the day the American family decided that the only safe way to keep meat was to plug in a machine, buy the meat pre-cut and pre-wrapped, and throw away anything that touched the back of the fridge for 2 days. We traded a crock that cost nothing for a lifetime of monthly payments and a garbage can that is always full. The skill that made a family independent was quietly replaced with a habit that keeps them dependent and spending. I did not see it for most of my life. I laughed at the crock. Therefore, let me keep going, because the deeper I dug into how these people survived, the worse the swindle looked and the better their methods proved to be. Take the brine barrel. This one is different from dry salting, and it is one of the most powerful. Instead of rubbing salt on the surface, you make a saltwater brine, strong enough to float an egg. That was the old test. My grandfather learned it from his own father. You dissolve salt into water and drop a fresh egg in, and when the egg floats to the surface with a spot the size of a quarter showing above the water, the brine is strong enough to preserve meat. Not a hydrometer in sight, just an egg and a lifetime of knowing. You submerge the meat completely. Weigh it down with a clean plate and a stone so nothing floats up into the air, and the salt does its work all the way through the cut, not just on the outside. Pork went into the brine barrel in the fall and came out as the family needed it through the coldest months. Add a little sugar and you get the beginnings of what we now call corned beef and country ham. The reason it worked in a poor household was that the barrel needed no power and no attention. You checked it, you skimmed it, and you kept it cool. But there was a secret ingredient some families guarded, and this is where it gets interesting, because it explains why their meat stayed a rosy pink instead of turning an ugly gray. They used saltpeter, a tiny pinch. What we now call it is a nitrate, the same family of compounds still used in commercial curing today. The old-timers did not know the chemistry, but they knew that a small amount, no more than a teaspoon spread across many pounds, kept the meat pink, kept the flavor right, and most importantly held back the single most dangerous spoiler of preserved meat. They could buy it at the drugstore for pennies. It was the difference between meat that was merely salty and meat that was truly protected. Now I want you to notice something. Everything I have told you so far cost almost nothing. Salt, fire, fat, water, a pinch of powder from the drugstore. These were the tools of people who had run out of every other option, and they worked so well that we forgot we ever needed them. But maybe you are sitting there thinking this is all fine for somebody with a hog to butcher and a cellar to store it in. Maybe you are on a fixed income, in an apartment, with one small kitchen and a tight budget, and you are thinking none of this is for you. Stop. This next part I put here on purpose. For you. Because the hobos who invented most of these tricks owned even less than you do right now. They had no cellar, no hog, no crock. Half the time, what they had was a tin can and a pocket full of salt, and I am going to show you exactly how you turn a few dollars of the cheapest meat at the store into food that lasts this week with nothing but your own oven or a windowsill. Start with jerky, the true hobo staple. You do not need a dehydrator. Take the cheapest lean cut you can find. The tougher and leaner the better, because fat is what spoils, not muscle. Slice it thin, against the grain, as thin as you can manage. Rub it with salt, and if you have it, a little pepper. Then lay those strips right on your oven racks with a pan underneath to catch drips. Prop the oven door open a crack with a wooden spoon, and set it as low as it will go. In a few hours, the water is gone and the meat is leather. That is preserved protein that needs no refrigerator and costs you next to nothing. If what I just said landed hard, you are not alone, and I want you to know I wrote all of this down in a book called Depression Proof, part of a wider set that includes Deep Frugal and the Full System, where I lay out not just these preservation methods but the entire framework these families used to stay fed and free when every outside system failed them. You can find it linked in the description below. Now let me keep going, because the deeper I dug into how these people survived, the worse the swindle looked and the better their methods proved to be. The men on the rails did the same thing over a low fire or simply hung the strips in the hot, dry wind. Dry meat cannot rot because there is no water left for anything to grow in. A pound of fresh meat becomes a few ounces of jerky, but those few ounces will not betray you when the power flickers or the money runs thin. Now here is the one that made the men who knew it survive winters that killed men who did not. Pemmican. You take that dried meat you just made and you pound it into a coarse powder, then you mix it with rendered fat, an equal amount by weight, and if you are lucky, a handful of dried berries. You press it together and let it set. That is pemmican, and it is one of the most complete survival foods ever made by human hands. Fat for energy, protein for strength, and it keeps for months, even years, because the dried meat has no water and the fat seals every particle from the air. Native people taught it to trappers, trappers carried it west, and the poorest travelers of the Depression made it in tin cans because it was the most food you could carry for the least weight and the least spoilage. A single batch of pemmican in a clean jar on your shelf is an insurance policy that costs a few dollars and lasts longer than anything you can buy in a bright package. That is the whole point. These people were not preparing for some fantasy disaster. They were solving Tuesday. And so can you, this week, with the cheapest cuts in the case. Therefore, let me give you more, because the ways they stretched and saved meat go far beyond drying it. There was the ash method, and this one sounds like superstition until you understand it. In some poor rural homes, and in more than one hobo camp, they packed cured meat in clean wood ashes. The ashes are dry, which pulls moisture, and they are alkaline, which bacteria hate, and they seal the meat away from flies and air both. A ham buried in a barrel of hardwood ashes in a cool corner could keep for a remarkable stretch. It was free. The ash was the leftover from the very fire that cooked their food. Nothing wasted, nothing bought. There was the vinegar wrap, a cloth soaked in strong vinegar, wrapped around a piece of meat, then the whole thing hung in the coolest, airiest spot they had. The acid on the surface held back spoilage and kept the flies off, and the cloth could be re-soaked as it dried. Corned beef itself is a cousin of this idea, meat kept in an acidic, salty environment that the microbes cannot survive in. And there was the simplest one of all, the one that cost absolutely nothing: location. These people knew that a north-facing wall stays cooler than a south one. They knew the ground a few feet down holds a steady coolness all summer long. They knew that a bucket lowered into a well, or a box buried in the shaded earth, or meat hung in a breezy dog trot between two rooms would stay cooler than the open air. They used the free physics of the world around them because they had no other choice, and it worked. Now stop and count with me what we have lost. We have lost the crock. We have lost the brine barrel and the floating egg. We have lost the ash barrel and the vinegar cloth and the knowledge of which wall stays cool. Every one of those was free, and every one of them has been replaced by something you plug in, something you finance, something that stops working the moment the grid does. That trade was not made for your benefit. It was made for the benefit of the people selling you the machine and the pre-wrapped meat and the endless replacements. I am going to keep going, because there is one more group of methods I have to show you before the strangest one of all, and these are the ones about waste. A Depression family wasted nothing off an animal, and the reason was preservation as much as poverty. Take the making of lard itself. When you render fat down into lard, you are not just making cooking grease, You are making the very sealant for the potting method I told you about earlier. The fat preserves the meat, and the meat gives you the fat. It is a closed circle, nothing bought. Then there is scrapple and head cheese, which sound unappetizing to modern ears but were genius. The bits and pieces that would spoil fastest, the odds and ends, were cooked down long and hard, which kills the bacteria, then set firm with the natural gelatin from the bones. That firm loaf, kept cool, held far longer than the loose scraps ever would have. They preserved the most perishable parts by transforming them. And there was the crock of sausage under lard, a combination of two tricks at once. Fry the sausage patties fully. Pack them in a crock. Pour the hot lard over until they are drowned and sealed. My grandmother did this every single fall, and I remember the taste of a sausage patty in February that had been sitting sealed in fat since November, and it was better than anything. The reason all of this matters, the reason I am sitting here handing it to you instead of letting it die, is that this knowledge represents a kind of freedom we sold off without knowing the price. A family that could preserve its own meat could not be starved out by a bad winter or a lost job or a store that jacked up its prices. They answered to no one for their next meal. That independence was inconvenient for a system built on you buying fresh every few days and financing the box that keeps it cold, so it was quietly, steadily engineered out of us. Not banned, just forgotten. Made to seem backward. Laughed at. The way I laughed at my grandmother's crock. But she was right, and now you are one of the few people left who knows she was right. So let me give you the last one. The strangest. The one I promised. I found it in a Federal Writers Project interview recorded in 1937, part of the oral histories the government gathered from ordinary people during the worst of it. An old man in Arkansas described how his family kept meat sweet through the hottest part of summer with no ice at all, and when I read his words, I had to read them twice, because it sounded impossible. They buried it. But not the way you think. They did not just dig a hole. They took the fresh meat and they wrapped it tight, and they sank it deep into the cold flowing water at the bottom of a spring, or into the mud of a cold spring branch, weighted down with stones. But here is the part that stopped me. Before they sank it, in some tellings, they coated it first. They coated the meat in a thick layer of rendered fat, or wrapped it in multiple layers of cloth, and then sealed it in fat so the cold spring water could keep it chilled without ever touching the meat itself. The genius is in the layering. The fat seal keeps out the water and the bacteria. The constant cold of the deep spring water, which stays near 50 degrees even in August, does the work of a refrigerator with no electricity, no ice, and no cost. The old man said his family kept meat that way for a week or more in the dead of a southern summer, and nobody ever took sick from it. It was refrigeration drawn straight out of the living earth. Now most of us do not have a cold spring out back. But the principle is the thing, and the principle is pure gold. Constant cool plus an airtight seal equals preserved meat. You can recreate that principle with the coldest tap water you have, changed often, in the coolest corner of your home, with meat sealed under fat exactly the way my grandmother sealed her crock. The old man in Arkansas and my grandmother in her pantry never met, but they knew the same secret, handed down along two different lines, and it very nearly died with both of them. That is what I mean when I say this knowledge almost disappeared. It survived in a government file box and in an old woman's hands, and tonight it survives in you. Let me leave you with this. Everything I gave you tonight, the salt and the smoke and the fat and the brine, the jerky and the pemmican, the ash barrel and the vinegar cloth and the cold spring, all of it comes down to one quiet truth those people understood in their bones. You do not need to be rich to be secure. You need to know what they knew. And that knowledge was taken from us so gently that we thank the people who took it. You are the kind of person who feels in your gut that the old ways were pushed aside not because they failed, but because they made us too hard to sell to. That instinct of yours is correct, and it is worth trusting. So tell me something down in the comments. Did anyone in your family keep a crock of meat under lard, or a barrel of salt pork, or a spot where the meat hung to stay cool? What do you remember? Type it out and leave it below, because this audience of ours is the last living archive of these methods, and every memory you share saves one more trick from disappearing for good. Tell me where you are watching from too. I read them. And if you believe, like I do, that recovering what our grandparents were forced to learn is worth more than anything a store can sell you, then come along with me. This is not about a channel. It is about a whole group of us quietly taking back the skills that made a family free. Next time I am going to show you how those same families kept eggs fresh for 6 months without a single cold box, using one cheap thing off the pantry shelf that most people throw away. You do not want to miss how they did it. Stay with me, and I will keep handing these down, one by one, before they are gone.